earlier you responded to the prompt of what is life, and that came from this page here of describe what you consider the distinguishing characteristics of life, what are common characteristics of all living things, how would you test to tell whether something is alive. And hopefully as you went through your write-ups, you made sure that all the tests or characteristics you listed, that you qualified yourself as a form of life. One of the things that I didn't purposely put into the prompt there is to go into a discussion of what do we consider something to be an intelligent life form. That is a whole different ball game in having to consider what makes something intelligent. I once had, when I was in college in an astronomy course, a professor give a presentation on ants, colonies of ants. And I remember walking out of that presentation absolutely convinced that ants are far more intelligent beings than humans are. So just perspective on things. With this, near the bottom of the page here, physicists, biologists, and chemists, what I'm going to do is give you a very brief overview of how each of those major disciplines of science kind of think about considering something a form of life. And just as we did with the coexist, the different ideologies of various cultures, we didn't make the assumption that just because someone was from India that they were naturally going to be a follower of Hinduism. The same thing applies here in that not all physicists are going to quickly rattle off the following statement that I'll give you in response to you asking them what you consider life. So for a physicist, in general, very broad, people in the world of physics consider life as something that can bring order out of chaos. A classic example I give here is with pennies. And if you have a stack of pennies in a nice column, and they're just sitting on the counter, and for whatever reason they get knocked over, so there's spill across the floor. If those pennies were then to somehow on their own reorganize themselves back into the original column or stack on that edge of the table, that would be considered a life form, something that brings order out of chaos. At the end of this presentation, I'll leave up a slide that you can hit pause on. Quick little insight into a new working definition of what it means by random in connection with how we might be able to pack things a little bit better. So I'll have a little reference to pennies and what we mean by random at the end of this slide presentation. You can hit pause and read what it has to say there as a matter of interest for you. If we were to consider and think about how the biologist would label something as a life form, this is how the vast majority of you have responded thus far with a biological approach. The very classic approach of if something is able to eat, sleep, move on its own, if it is able to reproduce, make things similar to itself, then that would be considered a form of life. And for a very long time in biology, this was very much the definition of life, is something essentially ate, slept, pooped, move on its own accord, reproduction. It would be considered a form of life. Recently, as biology is one of those fields of science that is just improving in its knowledge and accumulation of knowledge just daily, in the last few years, the definition for life from a biology point of view has come down to if something has a nucleus. So if something has a nucleus, then it's going to be considered a form of life. Those of you who have taken biology courses, some of you maybe even AP biology, you might be aware of the fact that viruses are not considered a life form as they do not have a nucleus. Day and age that we live in, most currently obviously with the coronavirus, the manner in which it spreads and reproduces itself, not quite technically what the virus does, we might be more inclined to think of as a virus as a life form, but viruses do not fall into the definition of life in a biology point of view, as it doesn't have a cell or is considered in the classification of a eukaryote. So something to consider there in these current times. Your chemists are going to consider something a life form if it's made up of the Chon particles. So capital C-H-O-N, Chon particles. The C is for carbon, H hydrogen, O oxygen, N nitrogen. Let's put up a slide here of these Chon particles. So the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. This is a little different look at a periodic table. Instead of by order of the elements, it's by how abundant these elements are in nature. So if we're made up of the Chon particles, then a chemist is going to say that it's a form of life. Now remember, if you approach a biologist, what you consider to be a life form, more often than not, you will get them to, you'll hear a response of, something has a nucleus. Ask a physicist what a life is, they'll probably go to a biologist approach like many of you in your responses did. A few may go to the adage of something that brings order out of chaos. Your chemists, likewise, probably give you a biology approach, something with a nucleus, able to move on its own, etc. But specific in the world of chemistry, though, we are going to look at Chon particles, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And at the beginning here, I mentioned let's make sure we qualify for a life form. And according to a chemist, definitely, we are a form of life, as we are majorly comprised of Chon particles. So 65% oxygen, 18.5% carbon, 9.5% hydrogen, and 3 3/10% nitrogen. Although there is this little quip that goes around the science in humorous circles that biology tells you you're 7% blood, chemistry tells you that you're 65% water, physics tells you that you're 99% empty space. Something to consider. Speaking of something to consider, this is the slide that those of you might be interested in thinking more about pennies and bringing randomness to order, and so maybe new definitions of random. You can press pause and read through that if you're interested. It's nothing that's going to come up on mini CKs or CKs for you, but maybe it's just a matter of interest.